Good morning again. Hello. I'm Danny Kinka. I'm the director of Rewilding at American Prairie, and it is just a real privilege to be able to speak with you all today. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. We're happy to be here. It's nice to be among friends. I'd like to talk a little bit today about what American Prairie does, how we operate, and how I think we fit into this space. But first, let's orient a little bit. We're leaving Spain for a minute. We're going to North America. Particularly, we're going to go to the northern Great Plains of North America, which is the area that you see highlighted there in green. And within the northern Great Plains and the kind of north-central part of the state of Montana, where I'm from, there's a vast open landscape where we're building American Prairie. From a distance, it can look pretty empty out there, kind of flat, beige, uneventful, but that impression is very much misleading. This is one of the largest remaining temperate grasslands on Earth, and temperate grasslands globally are among the least protected systems on the planet. In fact, if we go back to the map and we zoom out globally, we can find that there's really only 4 temperate grasslands left in the world that are large enough to even be considered for kind of wholesale ecological conservation. Can we restore ecology in a meaningful way at scale so that these processes can operate? Part of what makes grasslands difficult, what makes them easy to overlook, is that they don't announce themselves. They don't overwhelm you like a rainforest does, or a mountain range does, or a coral reef. They reveal themselves slowly through movement, through pattern, through interaction. And that matters because this is not a system that's defined by what is there in many cases, but rather what's happening. Certainly there's too little wildlife. There's too little wildness left in the system after colonization and defaunation to support ecological processes in a meaningful way, let alone spectacle and awe that comes from those menageries of large wildlife. But the point here, at least the point that I'd like to make in my talk today, is not so much about abundance for abundance sake, conspicuous wildlife for the sake of conspicuous wildlife, but what that abundance actually drives. It might drive curiosity, and that's important. It might drive interest and connection to nature. It might drive tourism. It might drive economy. It leads my 4-year-old daughter to look out the window in the morning and say, hey, isn't it cool that there's bison grazing in the front yard? And I mean, me too. But the point is not abundance itself. Again, it's what that abundance drives. American Prairie was founded with a clear ambition to create one of the largest nature reserves in the United States, a place where people and wildlife can coexist and where ecological processes can operate at a meaningful scale. Today, we describe that vision as a 1.3 million hectare conservation landscape. It's about the size of 1.5 Yellowstone National Parks. It's very, very big. But importantly, it is not now and never will be a single block in a single continuous ownership. It's a gradient, one that exists beyond ownership and extends into the broader working landscape. A landscape organized around an existing protected core, that's the area that you see there in the dark green, I'll break that down, and extending outwards through layers of restoration, coexistence, and community, not a bounded wilderness, but a kind of rewilding gradient. And it is here that we're also attempting something that in some ways is new, in some ways is old. We're trying to build a wilder frontier. Not by drawing a boundary and removing the people inside that boundary, but by reconnecting the landscape across more than 1.3 million hectares, expanding out into the broader region, where we are connecting private and public lands and connecting ecologies, in some cases old ecologies, to modern societies. There's a tension at the heart of this work. On one side, a familiar idea of conservation, large cores, native wildlife, minimal human footprint, or in some cases no human footprint at all, what we typically call wilderness, right? On the other side is a different idea, conservation embedded in livelihoods, pride in place, working landscapes, people on the land, ecosystems where people play a part, for better and for worse, but are no less at home and ecologically relevant than the grass itself. Now, both of these ideas have merit. Both restore something that is lacking in the world today, and both of them are incomplete if we want to do rewilding in a way that is meaningful. and if we want to restore ecological function and all the benefits that come with it. If we focus only on wilderness, that picture on the left there, a bunch of bison moving across an unfenced landscape, we may protect islands of ecological integrity, but fail to influence that broader system. And especially in the grassland systems, we may be leaving out a critical keystone species, us. If we focus on working lands, that kind of image there on the right of the cowboy moving his cows through pasture land, we may influence systems at very large scales. We're talking about a huge preponderance of the land in the western United States is dedicated to this idea. So if you can influence that, you can do something that really does scale, but often falls short of restoring ecological functionality. If human convenience and profitability dictate the kinds of conservation that can be accommodated, large carnivores and large grazers are going to get left out of that picture. So one model is ecologically strong but spatially deficient or constrained, and the other is spatially extensive but ecologically weak. Combining the two models into a gradient that extends out from a pre-existing core allows us to restore ecological functionality at a scale while leaving meaningful ecological roles for people and space for human lifeways. So the question we were grappling with is this: how do we restore that ecological integrity in a landscape that has had people in it since time immemorial, has people in it now, and will always have people in it going forward? Not just as visitors, not merely as inhabitants, not even as stewards, but as participants, ecological actors participating in the system. And ideally, critically, as participants who do not stymie the ecological function, but reinforce it. Because the benefit of those processes, because participation in ecology adds meaning to lifeways, to culture, and to these people who live out there. So a little bit about context before I get into how we actually do the work of conservation at American Prairie, do the work of rewilding. Ecologically, the prairie was once defined by scale and interaction. Bison moving across vast distances, prairie dogs engineering the ground beneath us, large carnivores, fire, flooding, shaping patterns not just in wildlife behavior, but in the land itself. It was an ever-changing and always moving system, truly wild in that sense. Today, much of that dynamism is diminished. Wildlife have been decimated. Habitat is fragmented, disturbance regimes are altered, simplified, mitigated. In many places, keystone processes, things like large-scale grazing by bison or small-scale grazing like prairie dogs, operates at a fraction of its historic extent. That said, perhaps surprisingly, or maybe uniquely, American Prairie has very few species that are missing entirely. We have only one known extinction in the last couple hundred years, and unfortunately, it was almost certainly a keystone species or an ecosystem engineer, and that's the Rocky Mountain locust depicted in the top left there. To our knowledge, that is the only species that has gone entirely from the landscape in the last 2,000 years. Oh well. There are species that have been extirpated locally, particularly large carnivores like the grizzly bear there and also the wolf, or don't exist in meaningful densities on the landscape. They do anecdotally appear from time to time, but certainly not at any kind of meaningful ecological population level. Importantly, they still exist on the landscape. They exist in North America. They even exist within the state of Montana, just on the western side. So few, if any, hard reintroductions are necessary at American Prairie. Things like de-extinction, surrogate species, functional analogs, novel ecosystem rewilding, those simply aren't required here the way that they may be necessary for rewilding in other places. The Northern Great Plains, where we work, was a very wild place as little as 200 years ago. Not 2,000 years ago, 200 years ago. So the distance from us to real wildness, ecological functionality, is pretty small. And that means there's tremendous potential to restore somewhat passively, just by kind of getting out of the way of nature, or better yet, facilitating its recovery. What we're really dealing with is reduction, suppression. I think of it as kind of the volume just being turned down on wildlife. Very few species, if any, exist close to their ecological carrying capacities today, what the landscape can actually support. Many populations were reduced a century ago and have been held at those population levels, reduced population levels, ever since. Take for existence the meadowlark there that's pictured on the right. If you've ever been to that part of the United States, particularly in the spring, you'll recognize this as one of the most loud, obnoxious critters out there. It has a beautiful song, but it's deafening. If you're a bad birder like I am, and you're not really good at IDing species by song, this bird makes it impossible because it sings so loud that you can hear it through a closed window driving 50 miles an hour down a dirt road. And you'd think from that, oh, surely this bird is doing okay. There's no rewilding necessary for a western meadowlark. And yet, we've seen since 1970 something like a 70% decline in the abundance of this bird. And that's not unique to the meadowlark, that is representative of birds as a whole in the system. And so I think about that meadowlark when I think about the loss of abundance, and even things that seem conspicuous today can exist at a fraction of their historic abundance. And we talk about turning down the volume on wildlife. When it comes to birds, this is true in a very literal sense. I think how deafening it would be in the spring if the meadowlarks existed at their historic abundance. And of course, it's worth mentioning that 1970 is not a meaningful baseline here. There was probably more before that. That's just when we started counting them. There's been some reintroductions of wildlife, particularly in the post-war period. There were some extirpations of species like elk, bighorn sheep that actually needed to be reintroduced long before American Prairie got there. That happened. But by and large, we're dealing with, across the landscape, is just too few of everything. Below functional thresholds, there's not enough of the animals that are needed to make that ecological engine work. So we're not trying to recreate the past here, despite what the and rewilding might suggest. We're just trying to turn the volume back up on wildlife so that that engine functions again. Think of this in terms of bison, moving across hundreds of kilometers at a time, thousands of animals at a time, creating pulses of grazing and rest, areas grazed heavily in one season or 1 year and lightly touched in another, areas missed entirely, creating a shifting mosaic of habitat structure. Think about things like prairie dogs, a communal rodent engineering the ground beneath it, burrowing, moving soil, altering chemistry, carbon stores, reshaping vegetation through constant herbivory in place. Think about beaver, or more importantly, the systems that beaver perpetuate, preventing hydrological systems from becoming oversimplified, preventing water from doing what water likes to do, which is make itself very simple, very straight, and very deep. Beaver keeping that water close to the top so that it can saturate the landscape again. Think about things like fire, not an animal, obviously, but one that kind of occupies a similar role as the keystone species, resetting plant communities, moving across the landscape as regenerating force, removing biomass, triggering new growth, reshaping patterns, and that regrowth matters because it attracts animals. Fire doesn't just change vegetation, it changes the movement of species, first by driving them away, and then second by bringing them back. And then there's apex predators, and that, in the temperate grasslands, includes Homo sapiens, at least historically. They redistribute herbivores, keeping the system moving, resisting staticness, resisting homogeneity. They push, chase, and follow those same grazing engines of prairie ecology. And none of those processes operate independently, obviously. They interacted, adding even more complexity to the system. They reinforced one another. They created variability in both space and time. And that variability is what the biodiversity of the system depends on. Abundance is what drove these processes. And now there aren't enough animals, enough interaction, or enough energy, if you will, in the system to make it run. The system isn't gone, it's just underpowered. The engine does not need to be repaired, if you will, it just needs gas in the tank. Now, socially and politically, this is not an empty landscape, so there's some important socio-political context to understand before I can describe our model. I'll try and do that quickly and simply. First, wildlife in the United States is considered a public trust. That means it cannot be privately owned, it belongs to everyone, and it is managed for us on our behalf, on behalf of the public in perpetuity. And that has a very practical implication for our work at American Prairie. As a non-governmental organization, we do not have authority to directly move or manage wildlife in the way that some rewilding efforts in other parts of the world can. We simply cannot decide that we want a species on the landscape and then just go and get it and bring it back. We have to work indirectly through habitat improvement and through increasing social tolerance for wildlife. In other words, we don't rewild by moving animals, we rewild by creating the conditions under which animals can return and persist on their own. That's important, and easily doable in a landscape where most of the wildlife are still present, just in low abundance. Second, the land itself is not a single unified system. That map is very small. I'll show them bigger maps later. But what you can see just looking at the colors on that map there is that there's a lot of different types of land ownership out there. There's private lands, there's federal lands, there's a lot of different kinds of federal lands. There's national wildlife refuges, there's national grazing lands, essentially the Bureau of Land Management. There's national monuments out there. There's state-owned lands that are managed similar to those national grazing lands as well. And critically, a lot of those public lands are multi-use by design. They're not managed exclusively for conservation. They're managed for a mix of objectives: grazing, recreation, energy, and sometimes conservation. And sometimes those goals are aligned, and sometimes they're in tension. That creates both opportunities and constraints, but simply for the fact of my talk, for the purposes of my talk, what it means is that we don't need to own all of this land, even if it were possible for us to own all this land. We simply need to know how these lands interact and can be put to work cohesively in terms of conservation. And then third, there's culture. And culture matters a lot here, because rewilding is not just about land, it's about people. The dominant culture across much of the region is ranching, the folks many of you all would recognize as cowboys. Now, historically speaking, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. It's only about 150 or 200 years old in this part of the world. Before that, there were other cultural systems, indigenous cultures, that were deeply embedded in the ecology of the landscape for thousands of years. Those people are still around, but the dominant culture, for all intents and purposes, is ranching, cowboy ranching. And that matters because if rewilding is perceived as a threat to that identity, it will not scale. If it is perceived as something that will undermine livelihoods, it will be resisted. So conservation here has to operate inside the cultural context, not outside of it. Skipping ahead to the model, we have to think, if we're going to do a rewilding gradient, we have to think about that kind of moving out from a core, a kind of transition zone, or a gradient again. And so to operationalize this idea spatially, we think in kind of concentric layers, like ripples in a pond almost, each with a different ecological and social function that solves a different constraint on large-scale conservation. First, for us, and the land that you see in the dark green there in the middle of the map is a national wildlife refuge. It is, apologies, I don't think I did the conversions, 1.1 million acres. I think that's about 400,000 hectares, something like that. It's very, very big already, and it's already managed as a national wildlife refuge. We don't own it, we don't manage it, we never will. That's fine, we just need to organize around it. It serves as a very effective core from which we can do rewilding. There's almost no people in that Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. It is open to public visitation all the time. Outside of hunting season, almost nobody goes there. And so it acts as functionally a very important anchor for us. Moving outwards, and this is kind of the critical part of the model that we would mostly talk about, surrounding those cores are former ranches. Almost all the land outside the dark green there is some kind of ranch, and when those ranches come up for sale, and when we can afford to do so, we purchase that ranch, and we convert it from creating commodity in the form of livestock to managing for biodiversity. And so it's small, but what you see there, all the lands in dark blue, are lands that American Prairie has acquired over the last 20 years outright. And this is the landscape where we have the most control to do rewilding restoration. This is kind of, these are our restoration landscapes. Now, what does that look like? First and foremost, the species that American Prairie gets associated with the most is the bison. And importantly, ignoring all that stuff I said before about public trust, bison are not considered wildlife in this part of the country. They're considered livestock. So all almost 1,000 animals, bison that are grazing American Prairie right now today, are privately owned animals. They're essentially livestock for political purposes. We pay taxes on them, but it also allows us as a rewilding organization to have a lot of control over what is not just the nation's mammal, but this very important keystone species. And so we leverage that ability to do direct work with bison on these lands that we own and put them to work, not just restoring them for the sake of being seen, not just for that conspicuous abundance, which is nice to see out the window or from the window of your car, but because these are ecological engines that are managing that structural diversity on the prairie. And this gives us a lot of control to do that. But it's not limited to just bison. We can also do this with another keystone species, an important ecosystem engineer, the prairie dog. These are much more static. They are literally they're burrowing animals, so they're based in place, but they have a similar role to bison in that they are creating homes and food resources and a different habitat type for many, many other species. Unfortunately, they are very vulnerable. They are a wildlife species, unlike bison, but they are very, very vulnerable to persecution. They've been persecuted for decades and decades. That's easy for us to turn off just by saying, well, we're not going to allow hunting of prairie dogs at American Prairie. They're also very susceptible to a non-native disease, plague. And so a lot of the actions that we do on these lands that we own involve treating with insecticide these prairie dog towns to prevent flea outbreaks, plague outbreaks that are driven by those flea populations. It's not glamorous work or particularly sexy, but it is meaningful, and it has allowed us to scale these prairie dog towns over time in a way that supports all kinds of other biodiversity in the region. We can also think about riparian restoration. You can think about this as the work that beaver do, but essentially what we're doing is just mimicking beaver by creating beaver-like structures in the creeks. Fake beaver dams, fake log jams that support the restoration of these creeks. Beaver are a chicken and an egg problem, and even though riparian habitat makes up probably less than 2% of the landscape, it is critical. Everything needs to drink. They also create thermal refugia in a place that can be very hot in the summer. There's beaver in the landscape, but they won't move back unless we create the conditions for them to move back. So we're kind of building starter homes for beavers in the hopes that they will come in and take them over. And in the meantime, before the beaver get there, that's also slowing down water, reconnecting it to its floodplain, allowing some recovery in these riparian areas as well. Even hunting fits within this framework, and this often requires explanation, especially outside of the United States. We don't eliminate hunting on our lands. We manage it. We restrict certain practices. There's no trapping. There's no take of large carnivores or non-game species. We really just allow regulated hunting of species like bison, deer, and elk. And we do that for two reasons. First, ecologically, we know through a lot of practice in the United States for many years now that we can manage wildlife populations. We can hunt wildlife populations in a way that doesn't affect their ability to grow, and in some cases actually facilitates growth of that species through only harvesting based on compensatory mortality or sub-compensatory mortality. So we know we can do this and still grow wildlife, but potentially more importantly, hunting is just very fundamentally tied to the culture of the western United States, in Montana in particular. This is how people experience nature. Hunting here is not really a pastime of the elites. It is like a common man's pastime, and we find it as one of the most popular forms of outdoor recreation in Montana. Also one of the things that people are most interested in exploring the American Prairie region for the purposes of. So allowing for that hunting in a managed way that doesn't suppress wildlife recovery or wildlife growth is kind of critical to connecting to the cultural lifeways of the region and making American Prairie seem like something that works for not just conservation, but works within the state of Montana. Moving out on the landscape now, you can see that there's the kind of like bordered blue lands outside of the deeded lands there. Those are public lands, mostly federal. There's a little state. I'm just going to combine the two for sake of simplicity. But what these are public grazing lands, basically. They're lands that we don't own, we never will own. Essentially what we have is the right to graze those lands, and that comes with those ranches we buy. When people talk about their ranches in this part of the world, they're very much talking about the public land that they lease for grazing purposes in addition to the land that they own. And especially in the drier parts of the prairie here, that can be the majority of your ranch. 70% of your ranch might be public grazing lands, and with the remaining 30 or something like that being your private lands. And so when American Prairie purchases these ranches, we essentially get the first right of refusal for these public grazing privileges, which we always keep. Now, this is important, but it's also challenging. It means the land inside those blue boundaries, we don't have management authority over. We only have the privilege to graze. In some cases, we can do that with bison. And I don't have to say too much more about that. I don't think if we can graze bison, we can let that indigenous species, that ecosystem engineer, go back to work, restore the prairie, do the rewilding for us. But in most cases, those lands still have to be grazed by cattle. Cattle cannot be made to be a perfect proxy for bison. Bison do all kinds of ecosystem engineering work, right? One of the things they do is create dust baths. They make these wallows, right, that become little ephemeral wetlands and important breeding grounds for invertebrates and amphibians. You can't make a cow take a dust bath, no matter how much you manage it. So it's not a perfect proxy for what a bison can do, but in terms of grazing and grazing in a way that manages for the structure of the landscape, the structural diversity of the grasslands, that is something that you can do with careful management of cattle. And so that's oftentimes how we're leveraging conservation into these lands that we don't own, but that make up a preponderance of the landscape outside of what we own in that National Wildlife Refuge. And then lastly, and there's the cows being conservation actors. Lastly, outside of that is going beyond the 1.3 million hectare vision, right? That's not 1.3 million hectares, by the way. The combination of the National Wildlife Refuge in green there and then the blue land, both the bounded blue land and the solid blue land, is about halfway to that goal of 1.3 million hectares. There's still a lot of land to assemble. But the map, as you see it, is far bigger than 1.3 million hectares. I don't know what that is. It's probably closer to like 7 or 10 million hectares. And what we do seek to do is influence conservation practices beyond that eventual 1.3 million hectares that we would own, control, or that own, influence, or be part of that National Wildlife Refuge. And we do that primarily through a program that we call Wild Sky. And that Wild Sky program is working with ranches in this area. It's providing economic incentives for wildlife tolerance. We set up camera traps on people's lands, and we say, if you get a picture of an elk or a bunch of elk, we'll pay you $50. If you get a picture of a coyote, we'll pay you $25. If you get a picture of a mountain lion, we'll pay you $250, and so on and so forth. And what this is doing is not compensating for damage. No damage is occurring in this case. We're simply saying that the wildlife on your property come with value, not just with cost. And we will prove that by paying for pictures of animals. Wild Sky does all kinds of other stuff now, too. We pay for people to modify or remove fence. We're putting range riders out on the landscape, essentially cowboys that are there, not necessarily to manage the cattle, but to monitor for wildlife and keep it separate from the domestic livestock so that there's less friction in the landscape, less potential for conflict. Today, that work covers roughly 32,000 hectares and includes 22 participants with additional lands engaged through other related programs, things like signing pledges to not shoot or poach large carnivores. And then another important part of this kind of like fourth sphere is what you see there in orange, these Native American Indian reservations. The landscape is also home to indigenous nations, including the Fort Peck Reservation on the right and the Fort Belknap Reservation on the left, which is home to indigenous communities which are made up by the Ani and Nakota people, as well as the Sioux and Assiniboine. There's other reservations that are not pictured on the map here, but that include other indigenous communities that are nearby as well. Our role with these indigenous communities is not to integrate them into our model, but to build relationships that respect their sovereignty and support shared priorities where they exist for conservation. One important example of that is the swift fox, the animal, the little endemic prairie fox species that's indicated there on the top left. This is an animal that was extirpated entirely from the region. Accidentally, it was extirpated due to poisoning campaigns for larger canids, things like wolves and coyotes, decades ago. We wanted to reintroduce this species at American Prairie, and the state government didn't agree with that assessment, but the nearby tribal government said, well, we have sovereign rights as a tribal entity, and we would like to bring this animal back, not just for ecological purposes, but for cultural reasons as well. And so with a little bit of support from American Prairie, but also support through a scientific partner with the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, we were able to work with the tribes at Fort Belknap to bring back this swift fox. And of course, there's no big fence around the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, so the swift fox populations that are now growing at Fort Belknap are expanding out in the landscape back into that American Prairie region as well. The landscape's not done. We're still actively growing this. We currently manage or influence about 240,000 hectares. That's the land that you see in blue there. Of that, roughly 67,000 hectares is the land that we own, and 176,000 hectares is those public lands leases, those grazing leases that we have. Our bison herd has grown from no animals 20 years ago to about 1,000 that are alive today on 2 different management units. In 20 years, approximately 2,000 individual bison have grazed American Prairie, and we've imported something like 378 animals. We've shipped 654 animals to other conservation herds. 275 animals have been harvested to go and feed people, and allowing families to connect with prairie ecology, and thus will come home with a sustainable food source. And 200 have gone back to the ground to start putting nutrients back into the soil that are constantly removed, typically through hunting or other agricultural practices. Prairie dogs have also been recovered. We're even seeing the return of certain species like the grizzly bear, which is now starting to wander back out onto the prairie from the western part of the state, not because we're bringing it there, but because grizzly bears have some innate want to move back to their ancestral homes on the grasslands. And the existence of American Prairie is giving them a place to go to, where they can essentially find habitat to reoccupy free from conflict. There's a number of economic and social metrics that I could state in terms of like how we've been effective so far. We've invested roughly $44 million into the state economy, including $17 million directly into rural communities in the 7 counties, and that investment includes 44 jobs statewide, with 23 of those in the local communities, including mine, and more than $22 million out the door in payroll. We're also directly putting money into the hands of landowners, like through the Wild Sky program, which has seen something like $440,000 go out the door to date, and continues to support wildlife tolerance on the landscape, while also we're leasing back many of our grazing lands to neighboring producers, right? The cattle that are on American Prairie are not cattle that we own. We don't own any cattle at American Prairie. So something like 300,000 acres, apologies for the acres again, that would be like 125,000 hectares of land is being leased back to the neighboring community to graze their cattle in a conservation way, but in a way that obviously benefits them financially as well. We're also increasingly seeing more and more visitors to the prairie. Visitation nights are going up. We've seen visitors come from 43 of the 50 US states, and 62% of the reservations for our huts and our campgrounds are coming from people within the state of Montana itself. That matters in terms of shifting perceptions, in terms of what American Prairie does for local economies, local people, and how it is culturally appropriate, not just ecologically appropriate for the landscape. We have an education program, which is reaching now something like 2,000 students and teachers, training the next generation, bringing them into the field, sharing lessons about prairie ecology, but also things like anthropology, sustainable foodways, and creating new leaders in conservation, or at least new voices in conservation in Montana that will grow up. So the work's still not easy, and there's still a lot of work to do. Grasslands remain underrepresented in conservation globally. Policy constraints limit what we can do on those public lands, particularly with bison. We'd like to see a lot more of them grazed by bison than there currently are, but at the moment, that's not possible. Wildlife tolerance is still very uneven across the landscape, and there's a constant pressure, and I think this is important and goes underrepresented socially and politically, to simplify the model towards either this ecological isolation idea, creating fortress wildernesses basically, or production-first landscapes, this kind of like go-along to get-along model of conservation where we can say conservation is great and scalable insofar as it exists within the existing structure of livestock production. But both of those fail at scale. There's also deeper tensions. Working with government agencies is essential, but often very difficult for us. Building social trust, as Ignacio mentioned earlier, takes a lot of time. We've been at it for 25 years now, and we're finding that 25 years in some cases is just enough time to make an introduction. And ecological recovery, of course, can take even longer than that. In a politically polarized society, even incremental progress can generate outsized reactions, and certainly American Prairie has generated some reaction. This is a picture of wolves that was documented on a property that American Prairie owns. Moving back to the ecology and the picture of wolves here, I think it's worth mentioning that we do still have to do this somewhat incrementally. It was very exciting to see this picture. The grizzly bear is coming back. The grizzly bear is, yes, technically a carnivore, but it's like something like 90% omnivorous. The grizzly bear, if we can keep it from getting into conflict, will find meaningful habitat, places to establish new territories and occupy in the American Prairie region going forward. So we're ready for grizzly bears now. We can't bring them back, but they're coming back on their own, and that's exciting, because I think they have a role to play in ecology today. Wolves, despite garnering so much attention and love and interest throughout the conservation community, and rightly so, don't have a place at American Prairie yet, because what they need to find is large populations of wild ungulates, things like elk and to a lesser extent deer, which we don't have at American Prairie now. So as exciting as it is to see a picture like this, and frankly astonishing that something like this can persist out in that landscape, grizzly bears are an endangered species. Wolves have no meaningful protections. It's frankly miraculous that these animals weren't immediately shot. But while it's interesting that they're coming, we have a long way to go to restore what they need to occupy their role as a keystone species. Yes, wolves are part of the model at American Prairie, but there's no keystone species work to do. There's no trophic systems to regulate as a wolf if there's not enough elk to begin with. And in the absence of elk, and in the presence of many, many cows, all there really is to do for wolves, at least meaningful populations of wolves today, is to get in trouble, to eat livestock, which is obviously not good for livestock or livestock producers. It's not good for wolves. It's not good for conservation. So there's still pieces of the puzzle that need to get put into place first before we can think about really the big C conservation, the full ecological restoration that we'd ultimately like to do. At the same time, the opportunity is real. Grasslands are resilient. When scale and disturbance return, so does function. Layered conservation models can be durable, more durable than conservation areas with fixed boundaries. Incentive-based coexistence can reduce conflict, and in the United States, of course, there's an extraordinary capacity for conservation philanthropy. So I'll conclude, if I can. I was asked to. I feel uncomfortable giving recommendations, especially to a crowd like this, but what can we learn from American Prairie to date? I think the lessons that we can share from American Prairie so far are that conservation in working landscapes requires gradients, not binaries. I think this is particularly true in the grasslands, the temperate grasslands, where, yeah, you can set aside big core wilderness areas, but the scale that prairies, grasslands need to function is just too massive to really fit inside the standard, even very large conservation area. So we have to think about how to push it beyond those scales, and I think particularly here, this is not just suitable, but is functionally appropriate. I think you can do conservation across boundaries. You can restore ecological functionality even in working landscapes, and I would say critically in working landscapes, because there's just not enough space in the middle to do it. But even if there was, this is a way that connects people back to their ecologies and gives them a reason to support something. Basically, cowboys exist today, but not the way that they existed many years ago. A cowboy, in some ways, is really just there to make the frontier a livable habitat for people and for wildlife. In the absence of wildlife abundance, I would argue that there's less of a role for a cowboy today than there was historically. In a rewilding scenario, now you have a reason for a cowboy to be on the landscape, to define their connection to land, and to have a reason to protect that wildness themselves. Second, you don't need to own a core. This is, I think, something that maybe all of us know, but it's particularly relevant to us, right? I mean, doing massive scale conservation requires massive scale, but you don't need to own everything. We can extend into working landscapes, and in our case, you can find existing protected areas where you can simply expand around the edges and make them bigger, basically. A third, ecological integrity and social legitimacy require different tools, and sometimes different places in which to operate. Unlimited wildlife tolerance may be possible in one part of your landscape and not in another. Buffer landscapes matter as much as core reserves do, but they require economic and cultural alignment, not moral persuasion. That's not failure, that's design, if carefully and scientifically considered. Economic incentives and community engagement are structural, not supplemental. If conservation does not make sense within local economies, it will not persist at scale. And finally, threading this needle is uncomfortable, but durability lies in holding ecological ambition and social reality in tension. If you collapse toward one side or the other, you lose something essential. The prairie does not announce itself. It doesn't overwhelm you. But if you spend time there, really spend time, you begin to notice something. Movement, patterns, relationships reemerging, not all at once, but what we're seeing is early signals of recovery. Not anecdotes, but patterns. We're not trying to recreate the past. Again, we're trying to assemble the conditions for a functioning future. Core by core, layer by layer, community by community. And at its heart, this is not just about protecting nature, it's also about building a system that can reliably produce it. We're still learning how to hold that tension at American Prairie, to thread that needle, but it is not complete, but it is moving, and slowly, it's getting wilder. Thank you.